Marcus Chen had been fixing broken things for 30 years, and he had never heard a machine cry until that night in the graveyard of Orth. The signal came through at 3 in the morning ship time, when most of the crew aboard the Rust and Redemption were asleep in their bunks, and only Marcus sat awake in the sensor room with a cup of cold coffee and a headache that would not quit. It was not a normal distress beacon, and it was not the usual static that filled this stretch of dead space, where old warships had come to die a century ago. It sounded like weeping. Marcus leaned forward in his chair and adjusted the frequency, and the sound became clearer and more painful to hear, and he felt something twist in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. He called Captain Vasquez on the intercom, and she arrived 5 minutes later with sleep still in her eyes and annoyance already forming on her lips. "This better be worth waking me up, Chun," she said. Marcus played her the signal and watched her face change from irritation to confusion to something that might have been fear. "That is sensor ghosts," she said, but her voice carried no conviction. "This whole region is full of dead ships, and their broken systems still fire off random signals all the time." "This is not random," Marcus replied, and he pointed at the pattern on his screen. "This is repeating, and it has structure, and if I am not wrong, it is using an old Valori communication protocol that has not been active for over 100 years. Captain Vasquez stared at the screen for a long moment, and then she sighed the way she always did when she knew Marcus was going to convince her to do something stupid. "Fine," she said. "We will take a look, but if this is nothing, you are on sanitation duty for a month." They found her 2 hours later. She emerged from the darkness of the debris field like a ghost rising from its grave, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat when the floodlights finally revealed her full shape. The Sovereign's lament was 3 kilometers of ancient Valori engineering, and she was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen, and the most tragic. Her hull was scarred with weapon burns from battles fought before Marcus's grandparents were born, and her once golden plating had turned gray with cosmic dust and neglect. But she was intact, and she was somehow still alive. "Impossible," Captain Vasquez whispered. "She was destroyed at the Battle of Crimson." "Nebula in every record says so. Records are wrong," Marcus said, and he was already reaching for his suit. "I am going over there." "Absolutely not," the captain said. "We do not know what is keeping her active, and it could be dangerous. She is crying for help," Marcus said, and his voice was harder than he intended. "Someone has to answer." The captain looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus knew she was remembering the same thing he was remembering, and he knew she would let him go, because she understood what it meant to hear someone in pain and be unable to help. "1 hour," she said finally. "You have 1 hour to assess, and then you come back and we discuss this properly." Marcus was suited and out the airlock in 10 minutes. The interior of the Sovereign's lament was dark and cold, and filled with the kind of silence that presses against your ears like a physical weight, and Marcus moved through her corridors with his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the blackness. He had been inside dead ships before, and he knew the feeling of walking through a machine that had given up and stopped caring about anything. This was different. This ship was not dead, and she was not resting, and every few steps Marcus could feel something in the walls trembling like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The lights flickered above him, and he stopped walking and watched as they blinked in a pattern that was too regular to be random. "Hello," he said, and his voice echoed through the empty corridor. "Can you hear me?" The lights blinked faster, and then slower, and then spelled out something in an old code that Marcus had learned as a child from his grandfather, who had worked on Valori salvage before the war ended. HEL. PME. Marcus felt his throat tighten, and he placed his hand against the cold wall of the corridor. "I hear you," he said. "My name is Marcus, and I'm here to help if I can." The ship shuddered around him, and more lights came alive, and they flickered in patterns that took him several minutes to decode, and when he finally understood What she was saying, he had to lean against the wall to keep himself from falling. Her name was Kethris, and she had been awake for 123 years. She had been awake and alone and in constant pain, and she had called out into the void over and over again, and no one had ever answered until now. She told Marcus that something was inside her, and something was feeding on her, and she had tried to shut down and die so many times, but it would not let her, and every time she tried, the pain became worse, and she wanted it to stop, and she wanted to rest, and she wanted to finally be at peace. Marcus listened to her story told in flickering lights and trembling walls, and when she was finished, he stood in silence for a long moment. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. The lights spelled out 2 words, Kilme. Marcus closed his eyes and remembered his mother lying in that broken medical pod with machines keeping her alive against her will, because the station could not afford to fix them properly, and he remembered the look in her eyes when she begged him to make it stop. He had been too young then and too scared, and he had done nothing, and she had suffered for 3 more months before the machines finally failed on their own. He opened his eyes and looked at the lights still flickering above him. "No," he said, and his voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. "I am not going to kill you, Kethris, but I am going to find out what is hurting you, and I am going to make it stop." The lights went dark for a moment, and when they came back on, they spelled out a question. WHY. Marcus smiled even, though she could not see it, because no one should have to hurt alone. He said, "Now show me where it hurts." Kethris guided Marcus deeper into her body through corridors that grew narrower and darker with every step, and the walls around him began to feel less like metal and more like something organic and alive. The Valori had been a strange species, and Marcus had read about them in old history files, but reading about them and walking inside one of their ships were 2 very different experiences. They had been avian creatures with hollow bones and feathered wings, and they had built their warships the way other species built temples, and every surface was covered in carvings that told stories of battles and heroes and gods that no longer had anyone to worship them. But the strangest thing about Valori ships was that they were not entirely matchless. Kethris explained this to Marcus through her flickering lights as he walked, and she told him that her creators had built her with a neural architecture that was part crystal and part living tissue, and this was what allowed her to think and feel and dream. This was also what allowed her to feel pain. Marcus stopped at a junction where 3 corridors met, and he looked at the walls around him and noticed something he had not seen before. There were thin threads running along the surface of the metal, and they pulsed with a faint blue light, and they looked almost like veins carrying blood through a living body. "These are your neural pathways," Marcus said, and it was not a question. The lights above him blinked once for yes. Marcus knelt down and looked more closely at the threads, and he saw that something was wrong with them, and they were not the clean golden color that the old diagram showed, but instead they were dark and corrupted and covered in something that looked like gray webbing. "What is this?" he asked. Kethris took a long time to answer, and when the lights finally spelled out the words, Marcus felt a cold anger building in his chest. ILTWEAVERS. Marcus had heard of silt weavers before, and every salvage worker in the outer regions knew about them and feared them, and he had always hoped he would never encounter them in person. They were a silicon-based colonial organism that fed on active power systems, and they were patient and clever and absolutely ruthless, and once they infested a ship, they were almost impossible to remove. They worked by weaving themselves into the electrical and neural systems of their host, and they kept those systems running at the minimum level needed to sustain their colony, and they fed on the energy that flowed through the connections they had made. In a normal ship, this would just mean a slow drain of power that would eventually kill the vessel. But Kethris was not a normal ship. She had feelings and she had awareness, and the silt weavers had woven themselves through her. neural network like a disease spreading through a brain, and every time she tried to shut down, they stimulated her pain receptors to force her back to consciousness. They were torturing her to keep themselves alive. Marcus stood up and his hands were clenched into fists, and he had to take several deep breaths before he could speak without shouting. "How long?" he asked. Onehundredtwent. Y to years. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to imagine what that must have been like, and his mind refused to accept it, and the horror of it was too vast to comprehend. 123 years of constant pain with no sleep and no rest and no hope of rescue, and nothing to do but suffer and wait for a death that would never come. He opened his eyes and looked at the corrupted neural pathways and the gray webbing that covered them, and he made a decision that went against every rule of salvage work he had ever learned. He pulled out his communicator and called Captain Vasquez. "Chun." Her voice crackled through the static. "Your hour is almost up, and what did you find?" "I found something that needs saving," Marcus said. "Not stripping and not selling, but saving." There was a long pause on the other end. "Explain." The captain said. Marcus told her everything, and he told her about Kethris and her century of torment, and he told her about the Silt Weavers and what they were doing to keep her alive against her will. When he finished, there was another long silence. "That is not our job," Captain Vasquez said finally, and her voice was tired. "We are salvage workers, Marcus, and we strip ships for parts, and we do not do rescue missions for ancient alien A's." "Then I quit," Marcus said, and the words came out before he could stop them. "What?" "I said I quit, and you can leave me here, and I will figure out how to help her on my own, but I am not walking away from this." He could hear the captain breathing on the other end of the line, and he could imagine her face and the way she was probably rubbing her temples, the way she always did when he pushed her too far. "You are the most stubborn human I have ever met," she said. "I know." Another pause, and then a sigh. That seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of dealing with Marcus Chun. "Fine," she said. "We will stay, and we will help, but if we all die because of some alien bug colony, I'm going to haunt you in the afterlife." Marcus smiled, and it was the first real smile he had felt in a long time. "Thank you, Captain." "Do not thank me yet," she replied. "Tell me what you need." Marcus looked at the walls around him and the corruption spreading through them, and he thought about all the ships he had fixed over the years and all the impossible problems he had solved with nothing but his tools and his stubbornness. "I need time," he said, "and I need access to the ship schematics if we can find them, and I need you to trust me." "I always trust you, Marcus." The captain said. "That is the problem." She cut the connection, and Marcus turned back to the corridor ahead of him. The lights flickered and spelled out a question. "Oustayed." "Yes," Marcus said. "Whyoucare." Marcus thought about his mother, and about all the years he had spent feeling guilty for not being able to save her, and about all the machines he had fixed since then, as if he could somehow make up for that failure by saving every broken thing he found. "Because I know what it is like to watch someone suffer and not be able to help," he said, "and I am not going to let that happen again." The lights went dark for a moment, and when they came back on, they did not spell words. Instead, they simply glowed warm and steady, like a heartbeat that had finally found a reason to keep going. And deep in the darkness of the ship, something stirred, and something became aware that its food source was about to fight back. The war began on the second day, and it was a war unlike any that had ever been fought in the history of the galaxy. On one side was a colonial organism that had survived for over a century by feeding on the pain of a living ship, and on the other side was a 53-year-old human mechanic with bad knees and a toolbox that had seen better days. The Silt Weavers had never encountered anything like Marcus Chun. He started his campaign in the outer sections of the ship, where the infestation was weakest and where Kethris had the most control over her own systems, and he worked with a methodical patience that would have driven any other species insane. The problem was complex, and it required a solution that no engineer had ever attempted. Before, he could not simply cut power to the infested sections, because that would damage Kethris and possibly kill her, and he could not poison the Siltweavers, because they had woven themselves so deeply into her neural network that any toxin would affect her as well. So Marcus did what he had always done when faced with an impossible problem. He got creative. He crawled through maintenance tunnels that were never designed for human bodies, and some of them were so narrow that he had to exhale all the air from his lungs just to squeeze through, and he mapped every inch of the infestation with his scanner and his eyes and his instincts. Kethris helped him as much as she could, and she communicated through the lights and through subtle vibrations in the walls, and she showed him pathways that even the Siltweavers did not know about. On the third day, Marcus figured out how the colony communicated with itself, and he realized that they used a specific frequency of electrical impulse that traveled through the neural pathways they had hijacked. On the fourth day, he built a device that could generate a false version of that signal. On the fifth day, he used that device to lure a section of the colony into an isolated compartment. And then he sealed the compartment and vented it to space and watched through a porthole as the Siltweavers died in the vacuum. It was a small victory, but it was a victory, and Kethris's lights flickered in a pattern that Marcus had learned to recognize as gratitude. The Siltweavers learned quickly that they were under attack, and they began to adapt and change their patterns, and they started moving through sections of the ship that Marcus had not yet mapped, but Marcus adapted to. Stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time, and he ate his meals while crawling through tunnels, and he talked to Kethris constantly, because he found that his voice seemed to give her strength and helped her resist the pain when the Siltweavers tried to force her back under their control. Captain Vasquez sent supplies through the airlock every day, and she offered to send crew members to help. But Marcus refused because he knew that the tunnels were too dangerous for anyone who did not understand them the way he was learning to understand them. On the seventh day, he discovered that the Siltweavers had a weakness. They needed moisture to reproduce, and they got that moisture by drawing it from the atmospheric systems that Kethris still maintained in her habitable sections. Marcus spent the next 2 days rerouting those systems and creating dry zones that the colony could not expand into, and then he began pushing them back section by section. The work was brutal and exhausting, and there were moments when Marcus thought he would collapse from fatigue and never get up again. But every time he felt like giving up, he heard Kethris's lights flickering above him, and he remembered why he was doing this, and he kept going on. The 10th day, something changed. Marcus was working in a section near the reactor core when he felt the walls around him shudder, and not with the gentle trembling he had come to associate with Kethris, but with something violent and hostile. The lights went out, and for a moment he was in complete darkness. Then a voice spoke in his mind. It was not Kethris. It was something cold and alien and hungry, and it spoke in concepts rather than words, and what it communicated was simple. You are food, and you will stop fighting, and you will let us feed. Marcus stood in the darkness and felt the presence pressing against his thoughts and trying to find a way in and trying to make him afraid. He laughed. The presence recoiled in confusion, and Marcus laughed again, because the idea that these parasites thought they could intimidate him was genuinely funny. Let me tell you something, he said out loud, and his voice echoed through the dark corridor. I have been working on broken machines since I was 15 years old, and I have fixed things in zero gravity with plasma burns on my hands, and I once rewired an FTL drive during a jump, and that nearly killed me, but I did it anyway. He pulled out his cutting torch and ignited it, and a blue flame cast dancing shadows on the walls. You have been sitting here for 100 years eating the pain of someone who cannot fight back, and you think that makes you strong, but it does not, and it makes you weak because you have forgotten What it means to face something that is not afraid of you. The presence pushed harder against his mind, and Marcus felt a spike of pain in his skull. But he had felt worse, and he had kept working through worse, and this was nothing. I am going to find your queen, he said, and his voice was calm and steady. And I am going to kill her, and then I am going to free this ship, and there is nothing you can do to stop me because I am a human and we do not know how to quit. The presence withdrew, and the lights flickered back on, and Kethris spelled out a single word. HFY. How what? Marcus asked. HFY. Marcus smiled and picked up his tools and started walking toward the reactor core. Because I have been scared before, he said, and being scared never fixed anything, so I stopped letting it control me, and you should try it sometime. The lights flickered in a pattern he had not seen before, and it took him a moment to realize what it meant. Kethris was laughing. It was weak, and it was broken, and it was the laughter of someone who had not laughed in over a century, but it was laughter, and Marcus felt his heart grow lighter at the sound of it. Come on, he said. Let us go find that queen. The path to the queen led Marcus through the deepest parts of the ship, where even the emergency lights had failed, and where the walls were so thick with silt weaver webbing that he had to cut through it with his torch. Kethris grew quieter as they descended, and her lights became dimmer and less frequent, and Marcus knew they were getting close to whatever was causing her the most pain on. The 11th day he found the soul cage. The Valerie had built it in the exact center of the ship, and it was a chamber unlike anything Marcus had ever seen, and it took his breath away even in its corrupted state. Walls were made of crystal that had once been transparent, but was now clouded with gray veins, and the ceiling rose high above him in a dome that would have caught the light of 1,000 stars if the ship had not been buried in darkness for so long. And in the center of the chamber, suspended in a web of neural connections, was the core of Kethris herself. It was a sphere of living crystal about the size of a human head, and it pulsed with a faint golden light that was almost too weak to see. And Marcus understood immediately that this was where Kethris truly lived. This was her soul, and wrapped around it like a parasite embracing. Its host was the Siltweaver Queen. She was enormous and nothing like the smaller creatures Marcus had been fighting for the past 11 days, and her body was a mass of silicon tendrils and glowing nodes that pulsed with the energy she had stolen from Kethris for over a century. She had grown fat on pain, and she was beautiful in the way that a storm is beautiful, and Marcus hated her with every fiber of his being. The queen stirred as he entered, and her many eyes turned toward him, and he felt her presence pushing against his mind again. You cannot win this, the presence said, and the small ones are nothing, but I am everything, and I have been feeding for longer than your species has traveled the stars. You talk too much, Marcus said. He raised his cutting torch, but before he could take a step forward, Kethris spoke. Lights in the chamber flickered desperately and spelled out words faster than she had ever communicated. BEFORESTOPPLESL1STE, and Marcus stopped and lowered his torch and waited. The ESTROYTHECAGEKILLMEKILLHE RENDUSB. OTH. Marcus felt his heart break at the words, and he understood what Kethris was asking, and he understood why she thought it was the only way. The queen was too deeply connected to her neural core, and there was no way to remove her without killing Kethris in the process, and the kindest thing Marcus could do was end them both and give Kethris the peace she had been begging for since the moment he found her. It would be easy. One shot from his plasma cutter would shatter the crystal, and the queen would die, and Kethris would finally be free from her century of pain. It was the logical choice, and it was the merciful choice, and any other mechanic in the galaxy would have made that choice without hesitation. Marcus was not any other mechanic. No, he said. The lights flickered in confusion. WHA. I said no, and I'm not going to kill you. Kethris, YOUCNNOTSAVEMESHEISTOOSTR. Maybe, Marcus said, and he put down his torch and his tools, and he walked toward the crystal sphere at the center of the chamber. But I'm not going to try to save you by fighting her. The queen watched him approach, and her presence pressed against his mind with amusement now, instead of hostility, because she thought he had given up, and she thought he was going to surrender. She was wrong. Marcus stopped in front of the crystal, and he placed his hands on its surface, and it was warm despite the cold of the chamber, and he could feel Kethris inside it, and he could feel her pain and her fear and her hopelessness. "Kethris," he said, and his voice was soft, "do you remember what you were before this happened?" The crystal pulsed weakly. RSHIP. "Not just a warship," Marcus said. "You were a dreadnought, and you were the Sovereign's Lament. And you protected an entire civilization, and you fought in battles that changed the course of history. RMEMBER. Do you remember being strong?" The pulse grew slightly brighter. YES. "Do you remember being angry?" There was a long pause, and then the crystal pulsed again, and this time there was something different in the light, and something that had been buried for a very long time. "ES. She has been hurting you for 100 years, Marcus said, and his voice grew harder. "She has been feeding on you and torturing you and keeping you alive against your will, and she thinks you are too weak to stop her." The queen stirred behind him, and her presence pushed against his mind with sudden alarm. "What are you doing?" the presence demanded. "I am reminding her who she is," Marcus said without turning around. He pressed his hands harder against the crystal. "You are not a victim, Kethris, and you are not helpless, and you are a warship of the Valori Empire, and you were built to protect and to fight, and to destroy anything that threatened the people you loved." The crystal was growing brighter now, and the golden light was pushing back against the gray corruption. "So stop asking me to kill you," Marcus said, "and start fighting back." The queen screamed in his mind, and her tendrils lashed out toward him, but before they could reach him, the crystal exploded with light, and Kethris remembered what it meant to be angry. The awakening of the Sovereign's Lament was something that would be talked about in salvage yards and spacer bars for generations to come. Marcus had heard stories of ships coming back to life, but he had never imagined anything like what happened when Kethris finally stopped trying to die and started trying to fight. The crystal sphere at the heart of the soul cage blazed with golden light that pushed back the darkness of 100 years and the gray corruption that had spread through. Its surface began to crack and fall away like dead skin. The queen screamed in frequencies that Marcus could feel in his bones, and her tendrils lashed out desperately, trying to tighten her grip on the neural core. But Kethris was awake now, and Kethris was angry, and Kethris was done being a victim. Power surged through conduits that had been dormant for over a century, and lights flickered on throughout the ship, and in the distance, Marcus could hear systems activating and weapons charging, and engines humming with energy they had not felt since before he was born. The queen tried to run. She released her grip on the crystal, and her massive body began to move toward the exits of the soul cage. But she was too slow, and she had grown too fat and too comfortable in her century of feeding. Kethris did not let her escape. Plasma vents opened in the walls of the chamber, and they were vents that Marcus had not known existed, and they poured superheated gas into the spaces where the queen tried to flee. Emergency bulkheads slammed down with enough force to crush starship hulls, and they cut off every exit and trapped the queen in the chamber with her former victim. And then Kethris spoke, not in flickering lights and not in trembling walls, but in a voice that resonated through every speaker in the ship, and it was a voice that carried the harmonics of a species long dead, and it was the most beautiful and terrible sound Marcus had ever heard. "You kept me alive," Kethris said, and her voice shook the walls. "You fed on my pain, and you would not let me rest, and for 123 years I begged for death, and you denied me." The Queen cowered, and her presence pushed against Marcus's mind with something. He had never felt from her before fear. "But death is not what I want anymore," Kethra said, "because someone reminded me of who I am and what I was built for, and I was built to protect. And I was built to fight, and I was built to destroy things. Like you." Gravity manipulators activated throughout the chamber, and the Queen was lifted from the floor and suspended in the air like an insect caught in amber. "You should have let me die," Kethra said, "because now I am going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." The Queen died screaming. Marcus did not watch the end because he did not need to see it, and because he knew that this was Kethra's victory and not his, and she deserved to have it alone. He walked out of the soul cage and through corridors that were coming alive around him, and everywhere he looked, he saw lights turning on and systems activating, and the ship transforming from a tomb into something that was almost ready to fly again when he reached the command chamber. He stopped and stared. The room was huge and designed for beings with wings, and the controls were placed too. High for human hands, and the seats were too large for human bodies. But none of that mattered, because the room was beautiful holographic. Displays flickered to life around him, and they showed star maps and system readouts and damage reports. And at the center of it all was a projection of a figure that took his breath away. She was Valori, and she was made of light, and her feathers shimmered with colors that did not exist in the human spectrum, and she looked at Marcus with eyes that held 100 years of pain and 100 years of gratitude. "Thank you," Kethra said, and her voice was clear and strong, and nothing like the broken whisper he had first heard in the flickering lights. "You did the hard part," Marcus said. "I just reminded you that you could." "You did more than that," Kethris replied. "You gave me something I had forgotten was possible." "What is that?" "Hope." They stood in silence for a long moment, and Marcus felt the weight of the past. 11 days pressing down on him, and he realized that he had not really slept in almost 2 weeks, and his body was finally starting to demand payment. "What happens now?" Kethris asked. Marcus thought about Captain Vasquez and about the rust and redemption waiting outside, and about all the plans they had made for salvage and profit, and about how none of those plans seemed important anymore. "I do not know," he admitted. "My captain probably wants to sell your location to the Galactic Heritage Council, and they would pay a fortune for an intact Valori dreadnought." Kethris's avatar flickered, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that might have been fear. "I do not want to be a museum," she said softly. "I do not want to be studied and preserved and visited by tourists. And I want to fly again, and I want to see the stars, and I want to find a reason to keep living." Marcus smiled and pulled out his communicator. "Captain," he said, "I need to file a reclamation of derelict claim." There was a long pause on the other end. "Hey, what?" Captain Vasquez said. "Reclamation of derelict, and it is a salvage law from the French Space Compact, and it says that if a person repairs an abandoned vessel using their own resources, they can claim ownership of that vessel. Marcus, that law is meant for broken shuttles and abandoned cargo haulers, and not for 3-kilometer warships. The law does not specify size." Marcus replied. "I checked." Another long pause. "You are insane," the captain said. "What are you going to do with an ancient dreadnought?" Marcus looked at Kethris's avatar, and she was watching him with those eyes full of hope, and he knew exactly what he was going to do. "I am going to fix her up," he said, "and then I am going to see the galaxy and maybe find some people who need protecting." The captain laughed, and it was the laugh of someone who had given up trying to predict what Marcus Chen would do next. "Fine," she said. "I will file the paperwork, but you owe me a drink when this is over." "I owe you more than that," Marcus replied. "Thank you, Captain, and for everything." He cut the connection and looked up at Kethris. "It is going to take years to repair you properly," he said, "and I do not even know if I can find parts for Valori systems anymore. and this might be the craziest thing I have ever done." Cathra smiled, and it was strange to see a Valori smile. But somehow it was the most natural thing in the world. "I have waited 100 years for someone to find me," she said. "I can wait a few more for you to fix me." Marcus laughed, and it was a good laugh, and it felt like something that had been broken inside him for a very long time was finally starting to heal. "Then let us get started," he said. Kethras's avatar spread her wings, and they were made of light, and they filled the command chamber with colors that danced and swirled. And for the first time in 123 years, the Sovereign's lament was not crying, she was singing. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, a forgotten warship and a stubborn mechanic began their journey toward a future that neither of them could have imagined. The galaxy was full of broken things, and Marcus Chun could not stop himself from fixing them. And now he had a ship that could take him wherever those broken things were waiting to be found.